maybe we can just drop a few ideas on what would be the triggers actually for direct confrontations, triggers that would be within the countries, with the countries in the region, or related to Taiwan. So what would be if you were to make a list of what could be the triggers, or maybe false flag operation, or what do you think? Because China, it's not in China's interest just to take back Taiwan. So they need a trigger. And what will be what is your view? What are the conditions for China to go into a hot war with the US there in the region?
It's a good question. And like you said, China does not want a war. They know time is on their side. And if they just let time run out on the clock, they will win without having to fire a shot, essentially. And you see the U.S. desperately trying to provoke conflict with China. The U.S. Semi-secretly placing U.S. troops in Taiwan. The U.S. doing these joint patrols. And I think now Australia, maybe even Canada, which makes no sense at all, are doing joint patrols with the Philippines. And they're desperately pushing the Philippines out there to become increasingly confrontational with China. Again, despite the fact that it does not serve their interests at all whatsoever. Whatever it's not even an island. It's a reef or something, and they're fighting over this. And does fighting over that somehow give you something worth more than your trade and your cooperation and prosperity that you're enjoying with China? Does it? If you look at what the U.S. is doing, they're putting their bases in Japan, in South Korea, now increasingly in the Philippines. They're developing missile systems. I have an article and a video coming out on this. These new missile systems the U.S. is developing, and they're going to obviously deploy them immediately to Asia Pacific. That is why they're designing these, to shoot them at China, to point them at China and eventually shoot them at China. And what they're doing is they're creating a situation in Asia that makes it almost impossible for China to react in self-defense, because they know they're basically using Japan, the Philippines, South Korea as nation-sized human shields. That's what they're doing. And Angela, you've seen the policy papers put out by U.S. think tanks talking about how it will be great if China shoots missiles at Okinawa or mainland Japan. It would be really great if they did that, because then Japan and also South Korea, they would be compelled to then join us in this war that we really don't want to fight by ourselves. We really would like to have some proxies go into the meat grinder ahead of us. So this is the plan. And so that's why I think China is so reluctant to be provoked, despite the U.S.'s best efforts. Obviously, infringement on Taiwan, China's sovereignty over Taiwan, that could be a trigger. It depends on I think the U.S. is just going to keep doing things up the escalation ladder until they get a reaction. And they'll continue compelling the Philippines to do this as well. And I just hope China is patient and has a plan, and they realize that the Philippines will be hurting themselves more than they'll be hurting China in all of this. And I think they can manage to do that. And I think we should actually talk about Taiwan in more detail, and then we could talk about some of the possible triggers, because when you look at what they're doing ahead of the elections, Angela, do you remember when the elections are coming up soon? Do you know exactly when? Sometime next year, early next year?
January, I think it's January this coming January, mid-January. So that's the first, I think. Yes. It's probably 2 tours, so you need to have the absolute majority. If you don't have the absolute majority, there's a second round, right? So you have 3 parties. You have the Kuomintang, KMT, which is the Nationalist Party, the party, the original mainland party that went over in 1949 to Taiwan. Then you have the DPP, which is a proxy, US proxy, where you have the candidates were all pre-selected by the US. So you had Tsai Ing-wen at the beginning. You had actually at the very beginning, when they took power, was with Chiang Kai-shek, and then you have Tsai Ing-wen, and then you have another protege now that is actually running for this election. Which, by the way, there is a poll actually that came out today that says that DPP is going down, so it's not the favorite. And then you have the TPP. TPP, it's a new party. They were actually, TPP was supposed to have a joint ticket between TPP and Kuomintang, but at the last minute they drop, they drop out of the race. And there was Mr. Gou, who's the CEO of Foxconn. He was, sorry, he's a pro China, pro reunification. He just dropped out of the elections. But those are, I think, what would be interesting is that the shift of voices. So people that actually were in favor of Go, the CEO of Foxconn, would probably vote for Kuomintang. And you, at this stage, I checked the polls, there's 20% of undecided voters. But we need to be extremely careful, because in the history of the election in Taiwan, we had a few events where they actually, they were kind of rigged elections. 2004, Chen Shui-bian, just the day before the election, he was shot, but it was a fake shooting. He had scratches. And what he got, he won. He was not the favorite, but he won because of the compassionate vote. And so the Kuomintang was outraged. And what they did was to do, to check what did really happen. And they could not check on his body, what he had, what the scratches he had. And the people, the doctors that went to check him, they came from the US, and it was like very opaque, so we didn't know exactly what happened. And then we had in 2014-15, we had the Sunflower Revolution. So there was an attempt of color revolution, and because of that movement that was instigated by the US, there was a shift of votes in favor of the DPP. And we had again in 2020, they won because of the riots in Hong Kong, which were actually supported and funded both by the US and Taiwan. So you see, they managed to actually kind of rig the election, to influence the elections very unfairly 3 times. That's the 3 times that the DPP won. So what I'm afraid of is that probably you might have again another case where they're going to try to rig the elections.
Yeah, I was just going to say that no matter what people would try to logically vote for, the US is going to be in there interfering. You have to remember there's the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, which is just an NED franchise there on the island of Taiwan. They work openly together with the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. NED personnel go to Taiwan and vice versa. And I just wanted to talk about, again, Angelo, you were the one who pointed this out. And I think you did a very good job explaining the background of what these elections will be unfolding within. And this is from Al Jazeera. William Lai names Taiwan's former U.S. envoy as election running mate. And there's no U.S. envoy because Taiwan is not a country. So it's a fake envoy who had U.S. citizenship, who had lived in the United States, and is half American. And this is who they're going to name. And again, we keep hearing about Taiwan. It wants to be independent. It's democratic. And in reality, these are transparent U.S. puppets. And in this article, and then there's also this one in the New York Times, I'm going to read a little bit from these articles. They basically admit that she spends most of her time in Washington working with the U.S. government against China. That's what she does. So how about maybe we go to the New York Times article. And they talk about the U.S. does not officially recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Miss, how do you pronounce her name? Is it Xiao?
Xiao. The way actually in Taiwan they write what they call the pinyin. It's a bit different from China. So they have their own, but it's probably Xiao. Just the tone, the pronunciation might be different, but it's Xiao.
Okay. So Ms. Xiao does not work under the graceful title of ambassador. Instead, she is the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative. Instead of an embassy, her office is known as the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office. And this is what the U.S. does. They officially recognize international law, China's sovereignty over Taiwan, but everything else that they do, they are violating it blatantly. And so they have all of these de facto organizations and positions where they are interacting with Taiwan as if it was a country, even though it is not. And they talk about, for years, U.S. officials prohibited her predecessors from visiting the White House and the State Department. Such guidelines have relaxed over time, and she now pays regular, if discreet, visits to the West Wing and Foggy Bottom. She is an undisguised regular on Capitol Hill, as when she sat next to Kevin McCarthy, then the House Republican leader, last summer for a live stream discussion by his caucus's China task force. She really does have the confidence of people here in Washington, said Bonnie Glacier, a Chinese expert with the German Marshall Fund, who has also known Miss Xiao for many years. And then it says, it helps, Miss Xiao said, that appreciation in Washington has grown for Taiwan as a democracy, as a force for good, and as a true partner of the United States. At the same time, she said the threat from the Chinese government that talks of absorbing Taiwan weighs heavily. But under international law, China doesn't need to absorb Taiwan because it is recognized as part of China. And what she is saying to the New York Times in this interview or article about her is that Taiwan is it's not a partner of Washington, it is a proxy, is an extension of Washington's foreign policy toward China. So all of this talk about an independent, democratically administrated Taiwan is nonsense. There is no democracy because there is, as you point out many times, Angelo, there is no sovereignty. Everything about Taiwan's future is being decided by Washington, in Washington, for Washington's interests, not the people actually living on the island of Taiwan. And I just want to point out, Taiwan's trade with the rest of China is almost 50%. It's close to half of their exports go to the rest of China. And then in terms of imports, again, and China and most of the rest of China, and these are important inputs for their semiconductor and electrical component industry. So if they decide to pursue this independence, this illusion of independence, this subordination, this open subordination to Washington, and China decides to cut off the local economy in Taiwan, it'll disappear. Nobody can compensate for the rest of China's role in keeping Taiwan's economy afloat. Angela, is there any observations you want to make about this aspect? How obvious it is that Taiwan pursuing independence is going to destroy Taiwan, its economy, if not the island physically. How could people on Taiwan be pursuing their best interests by pursuing independence, which is not even real independence?
Well, sadly, when you look at the case of Taiwan, it looks so similar to what happened in Ukraine. Well, keep in mind that in Ukraine, even someone like Zelensky, he ran on a platform of making peace with Russia. So he had 73% of votes for him. And ultimately, not only was a puppet working against his own country, but ultimately, he didn't keep on his promise. The first thing he did was actually to go against his promise and antagonize Russia. So here we have very similar case. Sometimes it's just what we call soft coup. In Ukraine, it was violent, but they didn't need to have half the population to go in the street. Ultimately, it was a radical minority, a few thousand thugs in Maidan Square that took over. They were extremely violent. They were willing to kill. You had snipers there, and that's how they took power. What worries me is when you look at Taiwan's sovereignty and all the actors in this democracy, what we call the civil society, it's already extremely hijacked. When you look at the media, most of the media, you put the ranking of the largest media in Taiwan, you don't have pro-reunification media. They were kicked out, and because they found a way to kick them out. So you have Epoch Times, which is funded by the US, which belongs to Falun Gong. You have the Apple Daily, which was actually working for the US in Hong Kong, which they kicked out Apple Daily, but it's one of the largest media in Taiwan. So you list all those media, the information space. Additional to that, you have the big tech, US big tech that are there. When you have Facebook, Instagram, all those platforms, you can control Taiwan's democracy. And then additional to that, they've been planting the seeds early on. They changed the history books. They've been brainwashing the kids, even the culture. So you have this new generation that are brainwashed by Hollywood, Netflix. And also you have the history books. When Chen Shui-bian came into power, I think it was 2004, they changed the history books. So when you read the history books in Taiwan, for the kids, they learn that the history in Taiwan started in 1949. They don't take into account the 2,000 years of history, this common history that Taiwan has with China. So you see, it's a slow process, and this is why now you have this clash, this difference of voting. You have the kids voting, the young that are voting more for the DPP, the Progressive Party, and the older generation that are closer to, they understand, they've learned a different history, and they're more pragmatic. You see that they are more for the Kuomintang, which is more rational, more pro-reunification. In 2015, there was a free trade agreement between Taiwan and mainland China, and that was almost a de facto step to reunification. Imagine they even had a plan to do a bridge between mainland to a small island which is extremely close to China. I think it's Jinmen Island, and that belongs to Taiwan. So you see, there was a symbol of this bridge between Taiwan and the mainland. And then what happened? Sunflower Revolution. That's how everything fell apart. And since then, it's been like completely a disaster. But again, just when you look at the polls right now, it looks like DPP is not doing well. So hopefully, let's see. Hopefully, the Kuomintang gets back into power, and they'll be probably more pragmatic.
Yes, and I want to point out a couple of things that you were talking about. And look, I understand the appeal of people wanting to believe that ordinary people have agency and they make their minds up based on rational decisions. We should respect their vote. But in reality, no. If you're being poisoned and misled from the moment you're born, all throughout your education, every time you turn on the media is showing you only one side. The vast majority of people raised in an environment like that are not going to understand what is really going on, and they're not going to be able to make a genuinely informed decision. In that case, democracy, self-determination is impossible. You're being manipulated, and you don't have the means to understand. Now, of course, there are exceptions, but the rule is the majority are not going to be able to see through it and understand it. And that is why I say, when you look at Taiwan and you see more and more people leaning toward independence, but then you look at this and you see how dependent Taiwan's economy is on the rest of China. What a disaster, a Ukraine-style disaster that would be for everyone there. You can see that they're making irrational decisions, running contra to their own best interests. And I'm pointing this out. Hong Kong, China, they don't have one for Taiwan. I don't think that they do, because they have the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. It's like a much larger NED intervention on the island. But this is just Hong Kong. And if you look at the nature of these programs, they're meddling in things that if China or Russia were doing this in the US, it would be headline news. It would create a row, possibly put us on the edge of war between the US and whoever was trying to do this. So we saw what happened even when there was imaginary Russian or Chinese interference. Imagine if either one did it on the scale the NED does. And if you go to their website, where we work, and you look at some of these, Hong Kong, they've been purged after the national security law went into effect. But if you go to some of these countries, I mean, it's just a list a mile long, just like 80, 90 programs and multiple organizations under each one. and this is the political capture by the US of a sovereign nation. This is how they begin manipulating people. They demand that there be democracy because they know they can influence people and how they vote. No matter how many elections they have in, say, the Philippines or in Myanmar, they know they can get an outcome that favors and advances US interests. It is not democracy, it's the smokescreen of democracy, behind which is the US political capture, modern day imperialism. I just wanted to point out this comment: take away the chips from Taiwan and their importance fades. And that is such a good point, isn't it, Angelo? And what is the US actually doing to Taiwan? They are actually trying to take the chips away so that they have no hesitation to just feed it into the wood chipper. And they are literally making Taiwanese chip companies build facilities in the US, transfer personnel, transfer their intellectual property to the United States, so that there's nothing left on Taiwan that is worth anything, so that they don't feel any guilt or any repercussions of burning it to the ground. And they're in their policy papers, they even talk about this. So Angelo, my worry is the United States obviously doesn't care about Taiwan. They know time favors China. They know China's going to get it back. They want to make the price as high as possible for that to happen, which means doing everything in their power to kill everybody and destroy everything and make it as painful as possible for China as they do so. That is what they're doing. That's what we see them doing in Europe with Ukraine, and also the EU just destroying their economy. We can't have it. Nobody will. I believe that the whole Israeli-Gaza conflict is all about doing the same in the Middle East. And this is what they have themselves articulated in their policy papers in regards to Taiwan.
Well, Europe is a good example. We see but they were very clear too. They knew that there was this cooperation which was very mutually beneficial. You had Europe needed for its heavy industry, especially Germany. They needed cheap energy, and they destroyed completely this relationship because that was extremely dangerous for the US. There's this huge bloc, Eurasia. Eurasia is going to be 70% of the world economy, probably. So it's massive, and so you have this whole bloc. If it cooperates together, if it's stable, if it prospers, would make the US irrelevant. And we see the shift. The shift is all there. But I think we need to look at what is happening. I think look at the big picture. This shift is happening. Every single day that passes, we are going to experience the shift. The shift is becoming more real. And the more closer we are to that, the more we are going to have the US, which is extremely weak, which will not be able to sustain different front, which will not be able, especially now, just think about it, the interest of the debt. They raise the interest rates. The interest of the debt of the US amounts to the same level of its defense spending, meaning that it's not sustainable. You cannot, they're not able to even repay their interest rate, and the debt is at over 30 trillions. So they're just desperate, and they need to do something now because they're losing the edge. The US dollar is the key. Once you lose the relevance of the US dollar, you lose the ability to print endless money. And that's the key. And that shift is happening. Even the US allies are ditching the US dollar. And that tells you that's a reality. And we need to look at, especially pay close attention to BRICS. There's another, just recently, did you know that Brazil announced it's going to join OPEC Plus? Imagine that power. And who's in OPEC Plus? It's all mainly countries from the global south. So now you have OPEC Plus, which is much stronger. They have the ability, they are starting to trade in non-US dollar currencies, in their own currencies. And now you have BRICS, and BRICS is expanding. And that's the shift. It's happening. It's just time. Time is in favor. Every single day that there's no war, especially with China, we are getting closer to a new reality, which is multipolar world. And they need to accept that's a reality. You need to accept. 15% of the world cannot rule over the 85%. And in this case, it's more like the 4%. The US is 4% ruling over the 96%.
And then out of that, the percentage of people in the United States that are actually driving this and benefiting from it is like less than 1%. So it's important to understand that.
You know, Chinese, they say, that's in Chinese, 上有建设,下有对策. It means if there are measures, you can have countermeasure. And that's what they've been doing all along. Imagine Russia has more capacity than the EU and the US combined when it comes to military industrial outputs. Just imagine China. I have seen with my own eyes the efficiency just to make things happen. It is like Russia multiplied by 10. It's going to be much, much faster. I would say the only way you could actually hurt China is if you manage to control the energy supply. But China, what China has been doing is actually over the years is to secure this energy supply. In the Middle East, it has very strong partnership. You can see actually, especially with the Saudi Arabia and especially with Russia. If you cannot manage to hurt China there, it's impossible. You can't beat China. On the worst case scenario, you might actually contain it. It's going to delay that shift, but I don't see. You know, it's a lose-lose approach what the US is doing.
Absolutely, and as I always say, and this is what I'll close on. China is a bigger country than the United States. It has almost 5 times the population, as you mentioned, Angelo. A much larger industrial base, also a military industrial base. They have weapon systems that the U.S. doesn't even have. I always hear China just copies everything because, you know, it's impossible for a non-white nation to be innovative. And yet China has weapon systems that are better than anything the U.S. has. Certain systems the U.S. doesn't even have. So who did they copy that from? And so between that, their economy, their growing military, just the size of their population, we've talked about their education system, the fact that they graduate millions more in terms of engineering, mathematics, science, design, everything, you know, useful skills that are used to shape the economy. You know, it doesn't even make sense for the United States to worry about being surpassed by China. It's a bigger country, bigger economy, bigger military. It will have more power. It's like Portugal having a meltdown because the United States has a larger economy than they do. It doesn't even make sense. It's completely irrational. Now imagine if Portugal had this zero-sum foreign policy where they were trying to reverse that. It would be completely insane. But because the United States has been number one for so long, people just take it for granted. And they're not looking at the fundamentals, going back to zero and building a thesis to see if it makes any sense anymore. It doesn't make any sense. There will be catastrophic consequences. The longer the U.S. clings to this delusion, they're going to ultimately do as much damage to themselves as they do to anyone else. So what needs to happen is the U.S. needs to find a constructive role to play among all other nations rather than insisting to impose itself on all other nations. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. And also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. It's not doing me any good at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you very much for that. And as always, thank you for watching.